waiting for folks to arrive. I hope everybody is having a wonderful, finally warm Friday. I'm so excited that the sun is finally out and it's possible to stay outside for a little longer than just maybe 30 minutes. Um, yes, I will remind folks of that. We're going to give it another 2 minutes before we get going. I think a 5 minute waiting for folks to arrive is reasonable. Okay, Cynthia, I think I
Ready?
can give you a cue. We're ready.
Hey, everybody. We'll have a lovely Friday sunny afternoon to all of you, and lots of gratitude for joining this really important conversation on a sunny Friday afternoon. I want to thank all the panelists for bringing this really important conversation today. As you all might know, there are tools out there that are pushing ads to you and maybe not some other people, or pushing ads to some other people and not to you. It's really important to know what is behind all of these tools that operate in many different um, places at many different stages in the employment process. And I'm going to hand it over to Mona Sloane to introduce you to your panel and kick off the discussion. I'm really excited to be a part of.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. From me as well, a very literally warm welcome to everybody to our Open Data Week event, Understanding and Addressing Algorithmic Bias in Hiring, which is co-hosted by the NYU Center for Responsible AI. Thank you so much to the team of the Open Data Week for organizing yet again another year of terrific conversations and events, for helping us put together this particular conversation. As Cynthia said, my name is Mona Sloane. I identify as a white woman with short brown hair. I have acrylic see-through glasses, and I have a white background with a graphic, green graphic in the background, and I'm wearing a dark blue sweater and a black jacket over it. I am a sociologist at New York University. I study and teach about the intersection of design, inequality, and AI. I am a senior research scientist with the NYU Center of Responsible AI. And I am also an adjunct professor at the NYU Tennis School of Engineering, where I teach young engineers social science skills. And I'm a fellow with the Institute for Public Knowledge at NYU. I'm wearing two hats today. I am both your sort of sociologist in residence, and I will also be moderating the conversation today. Now, before I introduce my fellow panelists and set the scene a little bit from a sociological point of view, I want to acknowledge that by being in New York City, I'm standing on the unceded land of the Lenape peoples. I ask you to join me in acknowledging the Lenape community and to commit to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. With me today are three absolutely wonderful NYU colleagues who will share their insight into hiring algorithms. We will hear from Hilke Schellmann, who is an assistant professor of journalism at NYU and an Emmy Award-winning investigative reporter. Gracie Sarkisian, who is the interim executive director of the NYU Wasserman Center for Career Development, and Julia Stoyanovich, who is assistant professor in the Department of Computer Science and Engineering at the Tannen School of Engineering and the Center for Data Science. And she's also the co-director of the NYU Center for Responsible AI. Now, please be reminded that this event is being recorded. I will introduce the topic from a sociological point of view. Then we will hear from Hilke, Gracie, and Julia. We'll have a very brief panel discussion, and then we'll launch into the Q&A session. You can ask your questions through the chat function. I will keep an eye on the chat and collect questions there and ask them then later in the Q&A session. Now, let's talk a little bit about the role that hiring plays and has played in society. Hiring essentially is a social selection process that in theory is focused on maximizing the success of an organization by acquiring and managing the right human capital. In other words, the intangible collective resources possessed by individuals and groups within a given population. That's sort of the formal definition of human capital. Now, as such, hiring is very much concerned with social relations, normative codes, and organizational structures as they intersect with individual and collective identities. Getting the right people into the right job is a major concern of companies. It is usually done through what is called human resources management, which is an organizational entity I'm sure many of you have encountered at one point in your life. Human resource management, or HRM, should not be confused with worker representation. That is something that is done through unions or other worker-led initiatives of representation. It's important. HRM is about maximizing employee performance to gain competitive advantage. Helping companies to maximize employee performance is really big business. The US staffing and recruiting market, which includes firms assisting companies to recruit new internal staff, as well as firms that are directly providing temporary staff to fill specific functions, was worth $151.8 billion US dollars in 2019. In 2016, the average cost for companies per hire was about $4,000. The companies spend a lot of money here. Against that backdrop, it seems really unsurprising that companies have turned to technology and technology vendors to help with hiring, particularly to those vendors that offer efficient and cost-effective solutions to finding the right individual for the right job within the right amount of time. Now, cue in automated hiring tools. Resume parsers, tools that predict personality based on text written by the candidate or on social media profiles, or even computer vision technologies that analyze quote unquote micro expressions of candidates. And Hilke will speak a little more about that. Cue in as well, mounting evidence of automated decision-making tools or AI adversely affecting individuals and communities that are already discriminated against. We see this with computer vision technologies having difficulties recognizing darker skin tones, or with natural language processing systems playing a role in shaping and amplifying societal biases and stereotypes, for example, around gender. And there are many other examples, and Julia will talk to us about what that specifically means in hiring a little later. And lastly, cue in how the deployment of such technologies affects the social dynamics, which have everything to do with power around job search and recruiting, or the way in which candidates relate and interact with employers. If you're a student, you are very likely to have had some form of interaction with an automated hiring tool, or you may be even aware of the many different ways in which these systems parse candidate information, and you may have shifted the way in which you approach applying for a job based on that. And I think Gracie will share a little insight on that later as well. Now, lastly, I would like to call us to localize these kind of points and also put them into the context of the pandemic. New Yorkers were more likely than adults nationwide to live in a household that lost employment income since the start of the pandemic, reflecting the far more severe coronavirus outbreak and the slower economic reopening. 3 months into the pandemic, in June 2020, unemployment rates in New York City were at 21.1% among Asian residents, 23.7% among Black residents, and 22.7% among Latinx residents, compared to just 13.9% among white New Yorkers. What that means is that automated hiring tools will fundamentally reshape how these communities regain access to employment and ultimately how we rebuild the city after the pandemic. Here in New York City, the different issues arising in the context of automated hiring tools and employment tools have not evaded the attention of policymakers. I want to point that out as well. You may or may not be aware of the proposed bill INT 1894, which would regulate the sale of automated employment decision tools. This bill calls for bias audits, and we have seen that topic pop up really everywhere in the media. It's kind of a hot thing at the moment, also in the research landscape. Auditing an algorithm is not a straightforward task. We have no clear definition of what that process can or should look like. Technically, we can do this in different kinds of ways and things, and we can happily share a little bit of insight on that later. Technical audits approaches are very important for understanding how exactly these technologies intervene into the social fabric and logic of hiring. But what is important to remember is that an audit does not necessarily interrogate underlying assumptions and politics of technology. That is a problem if the technology claims to predict ability and performance through the automated analysis of writing, social media, intonation, game performance, facial features, and so on. There's in fact a really well-researched and well-documented and well-criticized history of what is called physiognomy, which is the judgment of character based on facial characteristics. This history shows that bodily features and abilities bear no significance on either personality or ability, let alone future job performance. Technologies, we could say, that operate based on such assumptions are essentially problematic because they classify certain groups of people as inferior. So what I want to do as sociologists and residents is leave you with the thought that we must always assess bias in technical systems in tandem with sociopolitical histories and context and how these relate to power and oppression. And with that in mind, I want to pass it on to Hilke Schellmann, who can tell us a thing or two about the prevalence of hiring technologies today. Thank you, Hilke.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mona and Cynthia, for the kind introduction. And thank you, everyone, for being here. It's wonderful to see everyone on a Friday afternoon. So my name is Hilke Schellmann. I'm a journalism professor at NYU, and I'm an investigative freelance journalist. And I work mostly for the Wall Street Journal and MIT Technology Review. And I'm here today because I want to share a couple of things that I've learned investigating artificial intelligence used in hiring. And I've mostly done it in the US, but it's prevalent all over the world. And most people may not know this, but artificial intelligence can be found everywhere in the hiring funnel, as human resources folks call it. So hiring funnel is like lots of people at the beginning, and then folks get rejected as they go through every step of the application process. And in a recent survey of over 7,000 HR specialists, the result was that over 55% of HR teams in the United States use predictive analytics in hiring. So if anyone has applied for a job recently, you probably have encountered AI knowingly or unknowingly, and we'll talk about that. So I got hooked on investigating AI after taking a Lyft ride in Washington, D.C. from a conference to the train station to go back to New York City. And I chatted with the driver, and the driver told me he had a really weird day. And I was like, oh yeah, what happened? And he said, oh, I had a job interview with a robot. And I was like, a robot? He's like, yeah, a robot called me with 3 questions. That was really weird. And I was like, wow. And I was like, I made a note, and I was like, wow, that is really interesting. Kept his phone number. And then I forgot about it until I went to a conference a few months later, and a former employee of the EOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the quasi-regulator of work and hiring in the United States, gave a talk, and she shared what she was seeing out there, and that sort of led me to go down the rabbit hole and start investigating AI in hiring. And so I found out it's widely used in the US. So lots of people don't know that. And then also, for example, if you have applied to a company via ZipRecruiter, Indeed, LinkedIn recently, you have for sure encountered AI. And some of the times the AI is visible, or at least it's visible that folks are being assessed. So if you play a game, there's a few companies, including Pymetrics and Arctic Shores, who offer personality-based soft skill assessment in game format. So you know you're being assessed, right? You're playing a game. It's pretty obvious. Do you know that there's AI in there? You may or may not know, but you know that you're being assessed. And then if you apply to a Fortune 500 company, your resume and your job application will probably encounter a resume parser. That's a tool that scans resumes and often predicts if you're a good fit for the company by comparing every word on your resume with resumes of so-called successful employees in the job who've been marked as successful. That's something that Amazon stumbled upon over a few years back. So the company had built a resume parser with the resumes from successful employees, mostly men. And so the resume parser picked up those keywords common in men's resumes as indicators of success. And as a result, it downgraded resumes in which people included the word women or woman and 2 women colleges. So this, unfortunately, we've seen this a couple times with resume parsers when no one is supervising and actually looking at the variables that the system predicts upon. Another way that I've seen AI being used in hiring is one-way video interviews, where an employer sends you short video clips and you record your answers either on a desktop or on a mobile phone. And in that case, it feels like you're doing kind of a video presentation, and everyone I've talked to thinks they have a human recruiter watches the video, and that may or may not be true. And sometimes an AI analyzes facial expressions, intonation of voice, and the words that you use. I brought an example how that works because it is kind of sometimes difficult to wrap one's head around it. It's a 30-second clip from a video that I've done for the Wall Street Journal. So I'm just gonna share this.
I go into this knowing something that HireVue acknowledges many job candidates potentially do not. That my responses are being assessed not by human beings, but by AI, analyzing my tone of voice, the clusters of words I use, and my micro expressions. My rating is the result of HireVue's AI comparing my responses to those of actual employees. Essentially, my performance is being compared, my voice, my words, my facial expressions, against a company's highest performers.
So that's sort of the underlying idea that we often see, that there's a group of successful employees, and whatever their facial expression, intonation, or whatever the words they have on their resume, that gets benchmarked against the job applicants. There's actually now also even AI companies that help you beat the AI as job seekers. So those companies use algorithms to improve how resumes appear to other algorithms. So you may ask, who uses AI-based tools? Most Fortune 500 companies use AI for hiring. So it's from McDonald's to JP Morgan Chase to PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, AstraZeneca. The list is pretty much endless, and more smaller companies use it too. And the companies say they need technical tools because they're overwhelmed with job applicants or job applications. So IBM said they're getting almost 3 million job applications every year, and so is JP Morgan Chase. And the company feels that there's just no way that they can hire so many humans to go through these resumes and cover letters, and they need something that is more efficient and help them save money to go through the pile and find the best candidates for the job. And so there's a whole crop of vendors that cater to companies with these technology solutions. And the vendors sell this idea that this is a democratization of the hiring process. Every candidate gets a fair shake. since the algorithm will look at every resume and every video interview the same way, instead of a human hiring manager who just skims over resumes, looks at 20% of the resumes and makes biased decisions. And that's true. Human hiring, not very good. Lots of bias in that, as we know. But I found out that this democratization of hiring is not what we see in the wild. So, many times I have checked algorithms or have talked to people who have checked algorithms. They have found problems. And here are some ones that we found. So the science of reading facial expressions on someone's face during a job interview to predict success on the job doesn't exist. So we don't actually know if a computer reading facial expressions on someone's face detects actually real emotions. So for example, I've smiled many times when I wasn't happy. In a job interview, I smile. I'm probably nervous and not very happy, but a computer would detect that as happy. So we don't know what the underlying emotion is. And then also, we don't actually know what kind of facial expressions we need to be successful in a job. Like, what kind of facial expression does a teacher need, a call center employee? We don't actually know that. There isn't much reliance on science here in those kinds of instances. And so we see this again and again, that these companies use this benchmark of successful employees. Manager, a few managers go in and say, these are 50 successful folks, and they play the game, or their video interview data or their resumes are being used by the computer to find out what has this group in common, and that will be used to benchmark against job applicants. So as anyone can imagine, this approach can worsen underrepresentation and social divides if, for example, Latino men or Black women are not represented or inadequately represented in the pool of successful employees. It might just pick up more traits from white men. Companies say that they are making sure this approach doesn't lead to discrimination or disparate impact, as the hiring industry says. But we don't actually always know that. And additionally, what we often don't know is in these systems, if they're actually testing what the software says is measuring. Sounds very complicated. So for example, if you play online a game pumping up balloons to measure your appetite for risk-taking, is that really measuring your risk-taking at work when money and your job is at stake, right? We might behave differently playing a video game than we would in the real world. And then the other question following that, that's what experts have shared with me, is that, is risk-taking really a characteristic for this particular job? Intuitively, it feels right? I look at these successful employees and they have this trait in common. Must be a good thing for job applicants to be risk takers in this example. But the folks successful in the job might all have gone to the same school as well. Is that predictive of success now if they all went to Harvard? Feels a little bit more unfair. And what if the algorithms would look at videos and find out that most folks in the job have all brown hair? If algorithms are not supervised, they often take a correlation, statistical correlation, most people have brown hair, take that random statistical connection for causal connection and predict success in the job upon that. We humans know that brown hair makes you not more qualified or less qualified for a job, and we really shouldn't look at that. But computers may not know that. So in summary, we see this problem again and again in most sectors. Like technology is going faster and faster and changing a lot of things, but regulation hasn't caught up with artificial intelligence used in hiring. So, and there is a danger here because, and the danger is sort of in the scope, right? If a company receives 3 million applications a year and has a biased resume parser that downgrades resumes with the word women in it, it will affect 3 million people. And it can cause way more damage than a biased hiring manager ever could, right? The scope is just unprecedented of these algorithms. And so I'm hoping that by bringing more awareness to the topic and getting more researchers and journalists and stakeholders to think about this, we need to get like a deeper view into these algorithms and study them. So I'm writing a book on the topic. I'm researching algorithms with Julia and Mona. And if anyone is here who would love to speak to me about how they have encountered these tools and want to share their experience, I think that's also really helpful in understanding what is going on in the field. So thank you so much for listening, and I'm looking forward to answering all your questions.
Thank you so much, Hilke. I'm just going to pass it right over to Gracie, who has tremendous experience at the intersection of really people and these systems, and specifically students, which are very dear to my heart. Gracie, over to you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Mona. You know, a lot of my comments are going to build upon some of the things that Hilke said. You know, when I entered the field of education, I never thought I would be needing to teach students how to prepare to talk to a robot or a piece of technology. You know, we started, when we think about career development, you think about helping students explore interests and identify potential jobs for them. You help them think about what's the impact you want to make in the world, and I'm going to help give you the skills and the tools to get there. But the conversation has changed over the years because recruiting has changed over the years. Students experience hiring algorithms throughout their recruitment process, whether they're interacting with the chat box on the employer's website to ask questions, their resume and applications are going through an applicant tracking system. They oftentimes are invited to an interview via an automated process. I'll spend a lot of time talking about their experiences with the virtual interviewing process, like Hilke mentioned. Depending on the role of the organization, some students complete AI-powered assessments like Pymetrics. We even at the Career Center use AI-powered technology to help students get feedback on their resumes. So they get the initial feedback from AI, and then they come and meet with us, and they get deeper, more meaningful feedback. So we're using these tools as well. As early as a student's first or second year of college, that's so early, right? Their first or second, 18 and 19-year-olds, they're engaging with this technology because internship recruitment happens via AI-powered systems. And so we have to make sure that we're educating students about how to navigate these systems. Students have a love-hate relationship with AI. I will tell you, they generally love chat box. Students want questions answered 24/7 at all times, and chatbots can do that, and real people can't. The other thing they like quite a bit are when there are features on the website that do job matching, where you can put in your skills and they'll give you some potential jobs that are interesting to you. And since we know that Gen Z is thinking about careers earlier than previous generations, it makes a lot of sense as to why something like this that would help them explore careers is an attractive tool. Students are not so bothered by applicant tracking systems now. That wasn't the case in the past. Now they're not, because they've been around a long time and students have figured out kind of how to navigate these systems, right? They know how to use keywords. They know to look closely at the job description and use that language to help craft the language they're using on their application materials. But at first they certainly felt they were unfair. They felt that it, reduced a person's resume to a yes or no purely based on keywords and not the depth or quality of the student's experience or their personality traits. The other thing is applicant tracking system can look for keywords on your resume, but it can't necessarily tell that you changed jobs 6 times in 2 years. And so those nuances get lost in those systems. Where I hear the greatest complaints, though, from students in their interactions with AI in the hiring places are in 2 areas. The first is the student's genuine desire to make connections with employers. It's hard to replace that human component of, in a non-COVID world, shaking someone's hand or getting that response to the way that you answer a question, whether it be in Zoom or in person. The other thing that's important to note is that both Gen Z and millennials are 2 values-driven organizations. They want to work for organizations whose mission, culture, values align with their own. And it's difficult to determine that when you're being interviewed through a bot or having to do a pre-recorded interview. It's difficult to kind of get a sense for who are the people, what is the culture like when you're interviewing through these processes. And then the other primary concern I hear from students over and over and over again is around the virtual interviewing process. It does not matter how many resources we create or how many programs we offer to demystify the process. It just creates so much anxiety for students. They don't feel prepared unless they're used to communicating this way, unless they're privileged enough to have lots and lots of extensive preparation, but for the most part, our students don't. It feels very unnatural to talk to someone, to talk to a screen or a ticking timer that's not responding back to you. Hilke talked about the process a little bit, right? Questions are posed by a robot or a pre-recorded message. There's never a human listening in real time. In some cases, a human recruiter will listen to it or watch it after the fact. In many, many cases, it's just recorded and analyzed by AI, and that determines whether you're getting a second interview or not. So students feel like it's just yet another gatekeeper, right? I have to go through, AI passes judgment on me before I can even go and speak to a human being. And another important thing to notice, some students are warned that these technologies are discriminatory and privilege certain characteristics over others, which research shows is often the case. I've had students tell me that they've declined interviews with organizations. So they've essentially given up opportunities because the interview process was going to be virtual. And I hear this a lot from students of color, or international students who are not comfortable navigating this process, and students with disabilities. Some other common complaints about AI-powered interviews. Bot interviews often create more work for our students, right? Because it's not a human recruiter, they generally cast a wider net. So if you're a student that has a very low chance of getting this job, you still have to invest the time to go through the interview process because the employers are casting such a wide net. They also, and this is probably a silly complaint, but students find it silly that they have to get dressed up to sit in front of the computer, do their hair, their makeup, their clothes, worry about their background, find a quiet place, which is hard for many students, right? To appear professional on screen when there's not even a person on the other side. And I'll say, while students do like the scheduling convenience of I can do an on-demand interview whenever I want, I don't have to wait for, all the scheduling back and forth. They do feel like they have to do all this work first for AI, and then they're allowed to talk to a human being. And I address that a little bit. So generally students prefer the virtual interviewing process when they know a human recruiter will be reviewing the recording at some point. And many of the recruiters that work with us and that are recruiting our students who are using technologies like HireVue make it a point to tell the students that, oh no, me and my team are actually going to review the process. But even when answers aren't analyzed by AI, the automated interviewing process is just dispiriting to students because it just feels so one way. Students miss the dialogue of an interview, a back and forth conversation between two parties. It's difficult, and I hear this a lot, but it's difficult to give a full and engaging response to no one when there's no one on the other side. The other thing I hear often is it's difficult for students to learn about an organization and ask the questions that they can't find on a website through this type of interview process. It's hard to calm nerves when there's no small talk at the beginning of the interview. How many times have you interviewed a candidate that walks in and they're blowing the interview, but then you make them feel a little bit more comfortable and then they rise to the occasion and they do a great job. So that's not generally doesn't happen with these types of technologies. And then what happens when AI detects subtleties in behavior during a video interview? That's just the result of someone being nervous or uncomfortable. There's no human empathy that can bring contextual understanding. And I'm not a researcher in the field like many of the others in the room. So it possibly we're on the way to have AI-powered empathy, but I don't think we're there yet. So with that being said, there's just a lot of complexities that students have to navigate in an already stressful process. The job search is hard for all of our students because it's not like anything they've done up until this point. Up until this point in their life, they studied hard, they got a good grade, right? They did well in high school, they got into a good college. The job search, when there's no AI involved, is not like that, right? You do all the right things and you don't always get the response that you want. So we're preparing students for this difficult process, and on top of them, we're preparing them to engage with individuals and now engage with AI.
Thank you so much for that, Gracie, for that very rich description of the many difficulties that students face and sort of how that landscape is sort of shifting and changing. and emerging and how you're addressing that with your team, which is kind of a great segue for our last panelist, Julia Stoyanovich, who will tell us a thing or two about sort of the back end of things. Julia, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mona. And I'm really enjoying the presentation so far, I have to say. Thank you both for your insights. And so as the technologist here, I've been tasked with explaining how things really work, right? And this is an impossible task. It's impossible to tell you how automated hiring systems really work in 10 minutes or less. And it's impossible indeed, and not because of the time constraint. There is always a way to explain concisely and informatively the principles behind the operation of a socially transformative, elegantly designed, and rigorously tested system. Unfortunately, we are not currently in a position to describe algorithmic hiring systems in this way. And so rather than authoritatively telling you how things really work, I'd like to spend the next now 9.5 minutes humbly asking the question together with you about whether things really work and how we could tell. And I hope that the outcome of our conversation today will be that you will want to know more about how things really work in algorithmic hiring, and that we will be in a position to collectively demand the answers. As we already heard today, commercial tools are being used by employers, large and small, to hire more efficiently, source and screen candidates faster and with less paperwork, and identify promising candidates who will likely do well on the job. And these tools are also meant to improve efficiency for the job seekers, allowing them to apply with a click of a button, matching them with relevant positions, and facilitating the interview process. We also often hear the argument that the use of these tools can help us improve workforce diversity. And indeed, an argument being made very frequently is that because humans are biased, we have no choice but to use machines to step in and hire on our behalf. I'm showing here an excerpt from a famous study by Bertrand and Mulainatan, who back in the analog days of 2004 manipulated perceived gender and race on resumes and observed that applicants who were perceived as male and white received substantially more callbacks on the very same resumes. And so this is normally where I go into my soliloquy about how the same bias often exists in algorithmic hiring systems at various stages of this hiring process, and it has been shown to lead to discrimination against individuals based on gender and disability status and race, among other things. And here I would also say that AI is guided by data, and that data is a mirror reflection of the world, and so any and all effects of discriminatory behavior in the real world will be reflected in the data. And also, I would say that it may be worthwhile to wear corrective lenses, debias the data or the AI, or correct its decisions to brush up this reflection at a decision point. And I would also sound a warning that while brushing up the reflection may be worthwhile, we should not be fooling ourselves. To make lasting change, we have to work much harder to propagate changes back into the world. Debiasing on its own will never be enough. But with that bias conversation out of the way, what we are talking about today is, do these tools actually work? Are they picking up useful signal from the data, or are they an elaborate coin flip at best? As Arvind Narayanan, a computer science professor at Princeton depicted here, puts it, are these tools AI snake oil? If a tool helps improve workforce diversity, for example, it admits a sufficient number of candidates of each required demographic or socioeconomic group, but its decisions are otherwise arbitrary, can such a tool be considered fair? What if these decisions are worse than arbitrary? What if the tool is picking up signal like a person's disability status, and we have no way of knowing that this is even happening? What if it's measuring something about a job applicant that we have no reason to believe is relevant for the job for which they are applying? But perhaps I digress. So how should we know, how could we know whether a tool in fact works? Well, AI tools are engineering artifacts. We should not take the claim that they work on face. To know whether they work, we should use the scientific method. Formulate a hypothesis that states, in a falsifiable way, that the tool indeed selects employees who do well on the job and is better at predicting that than a random guess would be. So what is this falsifiability? The philosopher of science Karl Popper explains it eloquently, stating, a theory or idea shouldn't be scientific unless it could in principle be proven wrong or false. So let me give you a sense of how we might go about designing AI systems and checking whether they work. Suppose that you are asked to design a smart lighting system, something much simpler than an algorithmic hiring system. And that would be an AI that decides when to turn on the lights in your house and when to turn them off. How should your AI decide when to take these actions? We can start our design process by postulating a simple rule based on our own everyday intelligence. We will call it Rule 1. Turn on the lights when it's dark outside, otherwise keep the lights off. This simple rule is a classifier. It's simple, but is it any good? Does it appropriately capture how you would manually operate the lights in your house? This is my definition of good. To check whether the rule is any good, I will set it up as a prediction task. I will run an experiment, collect observations about whether it's dark outside and whether the lights are on in the house. And then for each observation, I will check whether the prediction made by my classifier, my rule, in fact matches what we observed. So let's give this a shot. We collect 4 observations called A, B, C, and D. And each observation is a row in the table that I'm showing you here. For observations A and B, the rule predicts that the light should be on, and this is indeed the case. That is, A and B both support the hypothesis encoded by my rule. Observation C also supports the hypothesis. It's not dark outside, and so we should keep the lights off. However, observation D says, makes a mistake. It's dark outside, yet the lights are off. Our rule was able to predict the output based on the input 3 times out of 4, and that is the rule's predictive accuracy. Now back to observation D, what is the cost of this mistake? As you probably guessed, it's that the smart light woke you up in the middle of the night. So what can we do about this? If we compare observations A, B, and D, we see that they have the same input, meaning that it's dark out, but different outputs. And this makes us think that we need some additional features to come up with a better rule. And so a decision that you, as the designer of this AI, have to make is, what are some other input features that may be useful? These have to be features that you, based on your experience, have reason to believe will be helpful in guessing the outcome. So what should these features be? The outside temperature? Definitely not. The price of tea in China? Also probably not. Now, what about whether it's bedtime? So let's define a new rule called Rule 2. Turn on the lights if it's dark outside and it's not yet bedtime, and otherwise keep the lights off. And we will conduct another experiment, collect some more observations again, and then we test our rule, comparing the outcome and each prediction that we observe, and we get perfect accuracy. Our rule was able to guess the outcome correctly 100% of the time. And it's even turning off the lights for us if we fall asleep on the couch. So caring. We are so happy with our smart light system, with how convenient it is and how it's helping us with energy efficiency, that we want to offer it to others to use. And so let's see if it works for our friend Anne to use it at her office. But before we go ahead and rewire Anne's entire office building, let's collect some usage patterns and see whether our rule works. So you know the drill. We collect observational data and we ask our rule to make a prediction for each observation. Oh no, only 1 correct guess out of 4. Assuming that the light is on about half of the time, this is worse than making a random guess, which would be correct half of the time. So why is the accuracy so low? The dataset on which we tested the classifier represents a different situation than the dataset on which we trained it. We trained the classifier at home, but Anne tested it at her office. And so whether it's bedtime or if it's dark outside doesn't matter much. What matters is whether the office is open. So what's the cost of a mistake here? The cost of a false positive, unnecessarily turning on the light, is that we waste energy. The cost of a false negative, turning off the light when it's needed, is that people are interrupted at work and their productivity suffers. What should we do? We should go back to the drawing table, think about what additional features to use, collect that data, design an experiment to check whether our rule in fact works. But this seems tedious. And most importantly, it will be very hard for us to continue deriving these rules that are getting more and more complex, depending on where the smart light is used. At home, at an office, at a hospital, at a cafe. These locations have very different requirements, and we may not know upfront what the usage patterns should be to come up with accurate classifiers. And so the answer then, presumably, is to learn these rules automatically from usage data. This allows us to overcome the limitation of relying on the common sense and everyday experience of the rules designer, and to supplement it with the experience of everyone else who works, lives, or hangs out at that location where we want to install the smart light. By taking historical observations as input, and with access to some additional informative features, we can ask the machine learning method to pick up the statistical patterns, learn the rules. For example, we may derive fairly complex rules that tell us to only turn on the light if it's a workday, not a weekend or a holiday, or only during business hours, and also to skip every other Friday during the summer, and to turn on the lights off earlier on days that are immediately before the long weekend. But just as we designed experiments to check whether the rules that we came up with were any good, so too should we design experiments to test in much the same way whether the rules that are automatically learned work when deployed. This is because what rule we learn fully depends on historical data. And if that data is representative of future use of the smart light system or an algorithmic hiring system, then the rule will work well. But if the actual use case is different, then the rule will make lots of mistakes, turning on the light in empty office buildings and waking up your toddler in the middle of his afternoon nap. So I'm wrapping up, but I would like to finish with this question. Whose responsibility is it to ensure that hiring systems are designed, developed, and used in ways that benefit all of us, rather than reinforcing disparities and benefiting the select few, or acting in ways that are arbitrary and uncontestable? Who decides what data these systems rely on, how they use that data, and against what objectives we assess them? Who decides how we prioritize the cost of one mistake or of 1,000 mistakes of one particular kind against 1,000 mistakes of another kind? And the answer is that we all have to decide. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Julia. I really appreciate that presentation as well. I learn something new every time I hear Julia speak. And I hope you share that experience with me. I heard a couple of themes sort of emerge from all three contributions. Hilke, you started off by asking, do you actually know if you're being assessed or not? Is the robot actually visible or invisible to you? And robot in quotation marks here, right? Stating that regulation hasn't caught up yet, and we can have a conversation about that. But you also very much spoke about the fact that there's a danger in the scope. And I think, Gracie, that came across in your presentation as well, where you said, well, actually, students feel really alienated. They miss the human. There's like a human cost here in the deployment of these systems, and it's kind of fundamentally shifting how students in particular think about entering the job market and under what conditions. And I was just really fascinated by your thoughts on how you prep students to talk to a robot. That is an absolutely fascinating account. Thanks for that. And then Julia, you kind of rounded it all up and said, well, there is a cost of the mistake and who is actually responsible for that. And I'm just gonna kick off the very, very short panel discussion. We'll launch right into a Q&A session right after that. Reminder, you can put your questions in the chat or later when I say go, raise your hand. But I would love to hear from our three panelists, whose responsibility is it in particular when it comes to the context that we discussed, which is students entering the workforce, and maybe even, you know, our local context, which is New York City. Hilke, why don't you go first?
Whose responsibility is it that these algorithms are fair and don't discriminate and predict the best candidates? I mean, I think it's a shared responsibility of the employers using them and the vendors producing them. What is the legal liability? That is a little bit of a separate question. The United States actually has pretty strict fair hiring guidelines, different than other countries, which I know is like you know, some fields counterintuitive, that we are also the land where artificial intelligence is being employed at a probably more massive scale than other countries. And so there it's like very clear that probably the companies will be the ones being held responsible in a court of law. So the problem is we haven't seen litigation or a court case really in these cases, and that's probably because people don't know that AI is assessing them, and they don't know if it's biased, right? Because, like, first of all, I don't know if somebody uses goes on my Twitter and pulls my personality profile, if I'm a team worker or not, and makes an assessment if I get the job or not. I don't know what's being done to me and to my application, right? Or if I do a video interview, I assume a human interviewer is watching that. I don't know that is IS assessing me. And I have no idea if in the pool of successful employees that my facial expressions are being benchmarked against, is there enough folks that look like me in there, or is it representative, or is it only men? I have no idea. So I think, and you know, we get rejected for job applications all the time, right? So, you know, how do I know if I'm being discriminated against or not? And so I think transparency and knowing that this exists even is like really, really important. And there have been in the past lots of litigations against assessments because people knew what they're being assessed for, right? Like if you would take a firefighter test, you knew I have to carry, I don't know, making this up, 90 pounds. And lawyers and advocates could go to court and say, you know what, I don't think it's fair that you ask people to carry, I don't know, 200 pounds. I think this is discriminatory for women. And we could have a conversation about that, right? But these tools, we don't actually know how they make their decisions if they're used upon us, and we don't know much about the system. So it's really, really hard to actually understand how decisions are made upon us. So I do really feel that employers need to test these and make sure that they're not only efficient and save the money and shrink the time to hire, but also actually predict what they say they're predicting. Actually picking the best employees because I don't know where anyone would spend money on like a random number generator.
Thank you for that. I'm gonna take that cue, right? Yeah, Gracie, go ahead. I have a special question for you, but delve right in, please.
No. You know, I'll just add that, you know, recruiters do say that these technologies do save them significant time, and time is money. So time and money, but you know, I think the responsibility falls on employers to be reflective and to see who are the candidates who are being hired most often as a result of these systems. And that's really the question that we're all getting to in different ways. And you know, I see it in my work that, you know, employers may want to create inclusive and diverse environments, but then they struggle to hire candidates that don't fit the mold, that don't look like the others who have been there successfully. And so, you know, I think another layer is needed. Yes, I agree with you, Hilke, that the employer's responsible, these vendors are responsible, but sometimes we don't see our blind spots. And so that's, I think, something that we don't want to get lost in this process.
Thank you, Gracie. Can I just really quickly take on to that? You said you are actually, you are training students to deal with these kinds of situations, but that you're also using these kinds of tools. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So we have excellent career coaches that work one-on-one with students and help them come up with individualized job search strategies. We have no choice but to prepare them to encounter these technologies if we want them to be successful in their job search. So it's an interesting conversation to tell a student that you're going to have to speak regardless of the fact that you're not getting any input. In real life, we're used to getting a response, we're used to getting a reaction. And that's really the hardest piece to train students, and to help them kind of consider that it might not feel like a normal interaction, but how can they still articulate the key points that they want to articulate? How can they still make sure they're highlighting their candidacy in the way that they should? We've actually, some schools have used AI technology longer than we have. We just a year ago launched a resume tool where students can upload their resume, and the resume tool gives them feedback on different sections, some things that they want to add, and it gives them a score. Students hate the score. And we always tell them, pay attention to the feedback, don't pay attention to the score. And we actually only use this tool for our undergraduates right now because we had to teach the system, right? We had to provide sample resumes of what were strong resumes. We had to first check and make sure there was no coded language on those resumes. So we first assessed the resumes, we uploaded them into the system, and now I don't even feel comfortable using this tool for a broad range of students because as you have more experience, the AI technology needs more information to give the best advice, right? And so we're experimenting with this, and I'll tell you, it takes some convincing to get students to use it because they're wary of these technologies. And I tell them, no, a human is still going to meet with you, right? We still want to have the meaningful conversation about how do you tailor it for that particular employer, but don't waste your time with keywords and formatting, get that out of the way and then get to the content with a human. But even there, we see a little bit of tension.
Thank you so much. And I would love to get back on the tension part in a little while. But in the meantime, let me ask Julia her own question. Who's responsible?
Right. And this is actually following up on the question that you did ask Hilke, right? And Gracie. And that is that I think that we need to really take it upon ourselves, each one of us, to take responsibility for holding these systems accountable, for even asking the question about whether a system should or should not exist. And this is broader than what Hilke said, right? Are we asking who's responsible for making sure that the system's fair and that they work? I think we should even all be debating here whether these systems should exist. And the reason that I don't think that holding just one group accountable can work here is because everybody has a limited view of the environment, right? So an employer is going to only know how the tool that was given to them by the hiring software vendor performs. A hiring software vendor is only going to know how the tool works in principle, right? So the vendor is going to know in principle how to turn on the lights. And the employer is going to know how specifically in their environment these lights are turned on and off and whether that is working. Meaning having access to the data and to the context of use makes it so that you can actually see how the system works in practice. But this is something that neither the vendor or the employer alone can do. But very importantly, there is also responsibility here on the job seekers to make sure that we all collectively understand how these systems are impacting us and that we speak up to contest a decision that was made to us, right? To take agency over that and to also contest the process overall. And for this, again, we need to be, as job seekers, we need to be enabled by the legal and regulatory structures that would then compel disclosure on the part of the vendor and on the part of the employer. But once that disclosure is made to us, which we should demand, we absolutely must speak up and correct things that affect us individually as well as others around us.
Thanks for that. I want to take that as a cue to talk about something that we said we would talk about a little bit today, and which is kind of keeping us all up at night at the moment, which is the question of audits and as a tool to sort of get at these very thorny problems. And so, Hilke, you recently published a piece about auditing. Can you tell us a little bit more how this is related to the questions and concerns and issues that were just discussed among the
Yeah,
panelists?
so the idea is we don't really have seen much government regulation, right? We've seen a little bit. There is a act in Illinois that if you do a video interview, you have to tell candidates that if AI is being used, that AI is being used, and they have to consent to that, right? We see a little bit, but we haven't seen any comprehensive federal regulation in this space. So one idea is, okay, could researchers, including Julia and others, sort of do audits outside the black box, right? Like, can they? They're not part. They don't have access to the data from the company. They're not part of vendors. Could they do an audit? They can, but it's very limited, right? Because these, especially in employment, a lot of these tools are being trained with successful employees' data, and most outside researchers don't have that data. So that's really hard to audit these systems. And so what we've seen a couple of companies in the space, in the hiring space, they have worked with third-party auditing companies to audit their algorithms. And this is like a paid relationship through like grants or salary that they've paid. There's two of them, Pymetrics, which is an AI-based game assessment, and the other one is HireVue that has come up again and again. They're sort of the leaders in the video interviewing space. And both of the audit, I have to say, I'm glad they exist. It is very helpful to get a sense of what these third-party auditing companies have said about the tools that these companies use. And the one that was done by Kathy O'Neill and her company on HireVue actually didn't do any technical testing, which we often assume auditing does, right? Somebody would go in and test the algorithm and make sure that there's no discrimination of people. That's not what happened. They had stakeholders discussions and sort of brought up issues that could be a problem with HireVue's algorithm. And it was very insightful to see that. There's some of the things where like, does HireVue's algorithm, is it actually being tested for folks with different dialects? So, right, like I answer a question, it takes my speech and transcribes it to text. Well, does it understand that pop and soda is the same thing? So that's one of the things. Or it also noted that, we know that speech-to-text transcription software has higher error rates for African-American speakers than for Caucasian speakers in the United States. So how does that, if your speech is transcribed less well than for others, how does it affect scoring? We don't actually know that. So those are issues that were brought up by the audit, and HireVue said they're looking into this. The Pymetrics audit was very different. It was they approached a computer science team at Northeastern. Christopher Wilson was sort of the main lead of this. He has done black box audits before of Uber and other companies without their consent. They didn't know that he was investigating them. And this one was with the collaboration of Pymetrics, and they were paid through a grant. And he did a thorough algorithmic testing and found out that what Pymetrics says in their marketing language, that the algorithm is bias-free, is almost correct. That it does abide by what we call the 4/5 rule, and there is a little bit of margin of error, but it is not biased in regards to women or men, and then 5 different racial groups that it tests for. And what has been criticized for that audit is that is great, that the company is doing what it says it's doing. That's good. But what was out of the scope of the audit is the idea like, well, does the AI games, do they measure what they're supposed to measure, right? This example that I had brought up is like, well, is risk-taking that we find in these successful employees, is that actually part of the job? Or are we testing for some random trait here? And then also the second question that comes to that, is that actually part of, do we actually need this in the job? And are we just doing a random correlation analysis here? He didn't address that. also in the technical audit, he didn't address what we've seen again and again in technical, in algorithmic usage is sort of intersectionality, where folks who are part of two marginalized groups, for example, women have, traditionally have been less successful in getting hired because of bias, and African-American folks as well. So Black women are both at the intersection of these two marginalized groups, and they often face real problems in this automated system because the training data for them isn't there, and the algorithms don't take them into account. So we've seen that in facial recognition software. It's way less accurate for Black women. But he didn't test for that with the parametrics audit. It is not required by the uniform guidelines, which the EOC gives out. But it has been a constant thing of researchers to say we need to test for that. And we also need to test not only for the numbers of women and men and the 5 different racial groups being passed through the assessment at this roughly the same rates, but are they also picking the best women and the best men? Or could it be that the algorithm, resume parser maybe finds out baseball is great. So probably because more men play baseball, lots of women play softball. So suddenly this tool might be better to predict success for men and doesn't for women. So it lets women through, but are they then more qualified to do the job? We don't know, right? We don't know all of these things. So they're not part of the audit. So the big criticism was like, well, this is a great idea, but we really need government regulation. And also the audits were so different from their approach that clearly there isn't a standard. We need a standard, and we need companies to abide by these standards, and we need government regulation is sort of what a lot of experts have shared with me coming from these 2 audits that we know of in hiring.
Thank you so much, Hilke, for that comprehensive overview. That was very useful. I want to ask Gracie a question, and Julia, and then open for Q&A. Gracie, we kind of heard about audit, and we heard Julia talk about contestability and sort of also our shared responsibility to address these issues when we come across them, even as candidates. And you spoke about how it's incredibly stressful for students to enter the sort of weirdly automated job market / hiring context, pack the pandemic on top of that, pack, the recession on top of that. These are extraordinary circumstances that are very stressful for individuals and students particularly. So I wonder if we could hear your insight on, is it actually reasonable, or can we expect students to flag these issues or organize, or how could we assist students in helping us with the shared accountability that Julia spoke about?
That's an interesting question. I've been thinking a lot about these students who are graduating, class of 2020, class of 2021, who had to very abruptly change the normal way of doing business, right? Their schools went remote, but the entire recruiting process also went remote. And so many employers that used to engage with students in person have been forced to move into the virtual space. So before, where it was only certain industries were using AI technology at higher rates, many industries were not using them the way that the banks were and technology firms were. When employers who are hiring in large numbers, okay, maybe you'd encounter AI technology, but every student didn't encounter AI technology. Now that employers are recruiting virtually, they're not coming to campus, they are giving their information sessions virtually. Employers who didn't use AI tools are transitioning to AI tools. I don't know what the post-COVID world will look like for our students. I anticipate that employers will be back on campus, but I don't know if they'll be back on campus in the same ways, because they've seen now virtually, look at my reach, right? I can do a Zoom session and invite students from 10 different institutions, and as opposed to going to each institution one at a time. And the next step is, well, I could have gone to campus and conducted interviews with X number of students, but now I'm going to do all my first round interviews via HireVue, and then I'll speak to the candidates who get past that. So it's becoming more and more of a norm. And so I actually do anticipate that students will speak up more, because more and more students will be forced to engage in the process. I think, Hilke said something earlier about, do you know you're interacting with artificial intelligence, or do you think that there's a person on the other side? And I think some of these systems are so sophisticated that our students don't know, couldn't distinguish one or the other. Now it's becoming more and more prevalent. More employers are using these systems. So I think as more students encounter them, more and more students will be speaking up, and I think we'll be hearing from them, certainly more than we have in the past.
That is great to hear, and we'll be excitedly watching and supporting, I think, at least from the center's point of view. I want to close this panel discussion with a question, very simple question for Julia. Julia, you're getting the simple ones with complex answers. How do you do a good audit?
It's very hard to do a good audit. Once your criteria are defined and there's buy-in on those criteria, it's easy, right? It's just a technique, really. But the difficulty here is really agreeing what a good audit is. What is bias? What does it mean to audit? Once that is clear, it's pretty easy to actually run the audit. And audits have their limitations, severe limitations, and that is we can't check for information that we don't explicitly collect. So my favorite example here is discrimination against individuals with disabilities, who very often don't say that they have a disability when they apply, specifically for fear of being discriminated against, right? And so you cannot really audit with the help of tools like, something like the 4/5 rule for discrimination against individuals with disabilities, because we don't have that information explicitly, and also because disabilities are just so varied. And so this is an example that always makes me think about the need for meaningful, again, public disclosure, telling people how they were evaluated, what features were used specifically, and how these are relevant to allow people to speak up. An audit alone won't do.
Thank you. On that note, I want to open up for questions from the audience. So if you could either put your question in the chat, or you can raise your virtual hand, which is in the bottom where it says reactions, and there's a smiley with a plus. You can click that and raise your hand, and I will be the professor and call you. In the meantime, we've had a question that both Hilke and Julia sort of replied, even though they were not supposed to. Which is about HireVue, which is our favorite example. And so HireVue actually said they pulled their facial recognition or facial expression analysis tool after the audit. Hilke, what happened, really?
So they actually pulled it before the audit, because the audit actually says we're not going to comment on that because HireVue has already said that going forward, they will not use the technology in new tools that they're building. So I think that's sort of the difference here. They didn't abandon the tool totally. It's in all the legacy products that they have with lots and lots of companies, Fortune 500 companies. Those that are already built the models, they will continue, and as they come up for review or are being changed, then they're going to start not using it. What they still use is assessing intonation of words and how we speak. And actually, Lisa Feldman Barrett, who's a very renowned neuropsychologist, she actually feels like this is the same as with the emotion recognition on our faces. Like, I might be smiling, but am I really happy? The same with intonation. We don't really know what the intonation means. So that is another controversial feature of the software that the companies continue. And although HireVue is the biggest vendor in the space, and they're discontinuing this controversial feature, great. There's still others. There's TalView and a couple other companies that still use emotion expression analysis in their video interviews. So it's sort of, I was talking to someone recently, and they felt like, oh, wow, it's like always like we say these things as AI ethicists and we have the evidence and we put it there. And then 6 months later, there's another vendor with the same technology again. And it's like, no, we just told you, we just showed you there's no science. And there's like a real problem here. but we haven't. There's always a new vendor coming up and using these technologies.
Thank you. And there's a follow-up question to that I'm going to ask first, which just popped up, which is there comparisons for these ABIs? Who does what? Rating and process of ABIs tools to get hired? That's a great question. Julia, do you want to take that one?
As far as I know, there isn't a comparison. And yes, there absolutely should be. And so, of course, my favorite metaphor here is one of a nutritional label. We should be attaching nutritional labels here left and right to data sets, to vendors and their products, to particular decisions that are being made and that impact the job seeker with the help of a vendor and a product. And by the way, when we talk about regulating the use of algorithms in hiring, I think we should again expand our scope and start investigating more closely and attaching nutritional labels to also human decision-making processes and processes in which a human and a machine interact. I mean, in reality, very few of these algorithm-assisted processes are autonomously done end-to-end by algorithms, right? There's always a human in the mix. So it's in a sense unproductive really to be separating whether it's a system making a decision or based on prior discriminatory behaviors of, history of hiring, or if it's a human right now, or it's some combination of the two. We should absolutely standardize. And until we've standardized, there is not going to be much progress.
I mean,
thanks, Julia. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so there is a New York City bill that is being debated right now on forcing companies that sell these tools in New York City to be more transparent, have an annual audit, and there would possibly might be a transparency component in that companies would have to publish their annual audits. We don't know what the annual audits will entail. Are they going to have a higher standard or a low standard? We don't know that, right? So there's questions about that. And I think there is, unfortunately, I'm still trying to find those analysts that look at all of these tools and compare them. And it's really hard because because it uses data that is different for every job and for every company. So it's not easy to universally say, oh, this resume parser is biased, because it's always calibrated on individual jobs and individual companies. There are very few off-the-shelf products that work for everything. Those could be easier compared. What we do know is that some companies pilot and test these tools and have lawyers and others assess these, and then they discontinue the tools. But that's not public. We don't know that. So I think if we could make that public somehow, that would be wonderful if there is a mechanism. But I think a lot of companies are very shy to publicize that they piloted this or tried this out and it didn't work, or they found disparate impact, or they found discrimination in these tools, because they fear that they will have liability in court, right? If they admit, oh, we had a problem, somebody might sue them and say, like, well, you had, I don't know, you had 10,000 job applicants going through this biased tool. I'm going to hold you to that. So I think that's the fear that companies have.
And Hilke, I'll just add, and correct me if I'm wrong, but when audited, there's no way to assess the candidates that opted out of the process, right? So if I'm a candidate with a disability and I'm able to get through interviews by telling the employer, hey, eye contact is really hard for me, so I'm listening to everything you're saying, but I might not be looking into your eyes, or I might be twitching my hand, and that might seem awkward, but I promise you'll get used to it soon. That self-advocacy that happens in a real person-to-person interview. If I'm a student or a candidate and I'm opting out of the interview, that's not even going into the audit.
Yeah, I mean, I do hope that companies who assess these systems also, by law, under the American Disabilities Act, they have to offer a accommodation, right? So if you say, I don't want to play a video game, I have a disability, they have to give you another way. But you're right. I don't know if companies assess their algorithms the same way they assess probably a traditional mechanism that they offer, maybe like an in-person or like maybe a two-way video interview or something like that. I don't know if you can actually compare them apples to apples. So I think that might be very difficult here. And I think Julia is always right with, the folks with disabilities, it is just really hard because there's obviously, it's so individual. So there's no statistical training data, and they really are being left out of these tools. And they often don't know at the beginning, before they take these tests, what they're going to be encountering, right? So how can they opt out if they don't know what's going to happen to them? So I think there's a lot that we have to think through. And somebody at the Alexandra Grivens, who's at the Center for Democracy and Technology in DC, actually has an idea that she said, you know what, maybe we should just route randomly folks into the AI tools, but then others who have to use the traditional route that, sort of folks with disabilities also get offered. So we don't have these two buckets of like, oh, here are the folks with self-identified disabilities, and here are the other folks that the AI tool has gone through, because that may not give an incentive to employers to actually look at the pool of people who need an accommodation. So that might be something that could be put into the law, that we can actually account for folks with disabilities.
Thank you. I'm gonna jump right in because we have two more questions that I would love to get to. And I'm gonna start with the last one, and I think, Gracie, this is for you first. The question is, it seems like college students' real-life experience with these systems are great tools for teaching them about how they will be encountering machine learning systems in the future. Are there ways to integrate career navigations of these systems with policy-based conversations in the classroom?
I think absolutely. I think that when I see the role of career centers as being the bridge between academia and workforce. And so if we are not connecting with faculty to help support the curriculum, if students aren't leaving with both the scholarly skills and the employer-driven skills to be successful when they leave, they're not going to be successful throughout their careers. So I absolutely think there's a space for this, and happy to partner with any faculty member that's open and willing.
Wonderful. Julia, do you want to take that cue real quick?
Yes, we would love to partner with you on this. Absolutely. So we will be in touch to speak. We teach a variety of courses, of course, that are kind of policy adjacent, but that also are related to responsible data science. In particular, Mona and I both teach to different audiences, right? And it would be really great to have your input.
Okay, I'm gonna gently move us to the last question, which I think is a really important one that we should hear every panelist briefly respond to. What should corporations and specifically HR teams do to validate their recruitment or hiring tools for bias? If external audits aren't as helpful, what can these teams do while we wait for regulation? Hilke, do you want to go first real quick?
Yes. Just be skeptical. I think the problem is that there is obviously too much trust in machines. And I've talked to, a lot of big companies that have general counsels. They look at this and make sure that the tools that they use abide by the 4/5 rule. So they don't have discriminate overtly against men or women in the 5 racial groups. But that's sort of it, right? They look that the minimal threshold is being met, but no one asks like, well, does this actually predict the best people? It's sort of like HR folks are, they're a cost factor in companies. They don't bring in money, so they always have to be more efficient, faster, and there is a real pressure on that. And these tools do help with that. So there is an incentive for HR folks, or for the head of HR to implement these tools. And I think just being really skeptical. I've talked to somebody who's a leader of an HR team with like 5 people, and they get too many applications for them to go through. It's a really mid-level company. And he told me, and I was like, well, are you supervising this resume parser, or you just believe what the vendor says? And he's like, well, AI is never wrong. It's artificial intelligence. And I'm like, oh, really? So I think this does happen. So you hope that HR folks are going to be skeptical and learn how to supervise this and question vendors. Like, what does this tool do? Like, what does it predict upon? Can we do a longitudinal study? Can we look at 3 years from now if the folks are really successful? Can we let in people you don't recommend and see how they do 3 years from now, right? Can we do these comparisons? And so I think one thing what I think is a good way to think about this, well, if facial expressions analysis would work for hiring and predict job success, wouldn't we have done this without the technology even? Like, it's like very simple. Like if we have science that works like this, we would have done this before technology existed. Why do we think technology solves this problem for us? It really can't. So I think I hope that HR folks become more confident in being more skeptical about these technologies and start to interrogate them. So I think in publicity and talking about this and making folks aware that there are problems in some of these systems, I hope is helpful to put more pressure on them to take a more skeptical look.
Gracie, same question.
I will keep it short, and just to add to that is ask candidates about their experience and integrate their feedback. I think sometimes we don't listen enough, and we just assume that these systems work. So in addition to being skeptical, talk to your user and use that data.
Thank you for that. Julia, last word.
Oh, sorry, don't mean to be the last word here, but I think that employers, being the paying customers, they can actually demand that the software vendors demonstrate to them what it is that they are paying for, right? So they should demand information about how the tool that they are getting, in fact, is worth the money that they're paying, and how it's better than a random selection process that is as follows. You have the criteria for the job that you can check against directly, right? Here are the specific requirements that we have. We also have some additional criteria that tell us that we need to have more or less equal selection rates, let's say by demographic groups, etc. So all you need for that is a stratified sampler. And that is a fancy but not too fancy coin flip. That is very efficient. It's very cheap. And so again, here the burden really is on the employer to not be fools. They are paying money. They should know that they're paying it for something that's worth the money.
Great, great last words. And with those, I want to, on time, thank my wonderful NYU colleagues and panelists, Hilke Schellmann, Gracie Sarkisian, and Julia Stoyanovich for joining me tonight. My name is Mona Sloane. Thank you also to Cynthia Kunti-Cook, who gave the welcome and is the chair of this, the stream of the events, who, by the way, does fantastic work as well. You should look her up and follow her amazing work. Thank you to Maria and Megan for helping us put this together, Team Beta NYC, who put on this Open Data Week. Every year, I've met the most amazing people in the field at these events. You should return next year. And with that, have a wonderful, sunny, relaxing weekend, and good night.
Thank you, Mona. This was lots of fun.
Thank you, Mona.
Yeah, thank you, Mona. Have a great night.
Thanks, guys.
Everyone.